Thank you, Governor Hogan. Welcome to all of you to this discussion about fortifying our future, the state's becoming more resilient. Let me start by talking about my own state because I'm getting ready to pitch it anyway. For the August 5 to 7 summer meeting, the NGA in Portland, Maine. But my state has 1.3 million people. It's small. It's the most dispersed population of any state in the country. It sort of juts out of the northeast corner of the country like a thumb hitchhiking towards Europe. Borders Canada. We're the only state that only borders one other state other than Hawaii and Alaska. We're 90% forested. We have clean water and rolling hills and fertile farmlands and mighty rivers and deep ports. And if you take our state and stretch it out as far as you can, the coastline, as jagged and crazy as it is with all the islands, you'll find about 3,500 miles of ocean coastline. So it's remarkable in many areas. But we're seeing the effects of disasters, both natural and man-made. In the small town of Machias, for instance, one of our easternmost towns, we saw extensive flooding in their historic downtown during the 2018 winter storm. Vinyl Haven, a beautiful island right across from the island where Governor Lamont summers, a beautiful island off the coast. It lands 10% of Maine's lobster catch. But the offshore island, that island itself, could lose more than 10% of its land to sea level rising by 2100, including much of its working waterfront. We're very concerned about preserving our working waterfronts. With state funding, Vinyl Haven is taking some critical steps to understand their vulnerability and plan for the future. In Portland, where I do again look forward to greeting you in August, they're already seeing a threefold increase in average annual hours of flooding in the past 20 years versus the past 100 years. That's impacting businesses along the commercial working waterfront and the working class Bayside neighborhoods. The city is now developing a plan, a comprehensive climate action plan. And our state, since I took over 14 months ago, has taken some decisive actions to prepare our infrastructure and our citizens for the incidents that could disrupt the entire state. Mitigation, I think, is the best adaptation strategy. The cost of avoiding the worst of climate change impacts is far lower than the cost of not adapting and living in the worst case scenario. So some of the steps we're taking. We want to try to cut emissions. 53% of our greenhouse gas emissions are from transportation sources. We're addressing that. Since January 2019, my state has joined the 25 states of the U.S. Climate Alliance, which represents now 55% of the United States population. We've set a goal to achieve statewide carbon neutrality by 2045, because we are seeing rising oceans. The Gulf of Maine is warming faster than 99% of all ocean bodies. With the legislature's agreement, we established the Maine Climate Council, which will recommend a more comprehensive plan this December. And they're looking at transportation sources, heating sources, and resiliency. We're the most fossil fuel dependent state when it comes to heating sources. We've set in statute a requirement that there would be a 45% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and an 80% reduction by 2050. We've taken great pains to redo our renewable portfolio standards. We're looking at 80% renewables by 2030, up from 40%, and a goal of 100% renewable power by 2050. We have the most significant renewable standards in the country. And we've established by law an aggressive goal of installing 100,000 heat pumps by 2025. Many of us were at the Korean ambassador's residence last night, and he was describing the architecture of the building and how it was modeled on historical homes in Korea. And I looked up, and above our heads were two large heat pumps. And I thought, well, that's adaptation. And in the house, the governor's mansion where I reside during the week, there are 22 heat pumps. Those were put in by my predecessor. So it's a bipartisan effort to reduce our dependency on fossil fuels for heat. And we're supporting electrification to facilitate that. We think Maine consumers can save on their heating bills and save costs overall by using heat pumps. We have facilitated the launch of the first floating offshore wind demonstration project in the United States with leadership and research from the University of Maine, which has developed the prototype for a floating offshore wind platform that is concrete-based, not steel-based, much more adaptable to manufacturing onshore and to movement on the coast, with support from the Federal Department of Energy. We've launched an electric vehicle rebate program and charging infrastructure programs using not taxpayer monies, but the Volkswagen settlement funds. Some of us who were former attorneys general, like Mr. Bashir, Mr. Cooper, myself, and Mr. Bullock, sued Volkswagen of America over several respects in tandem with the federal government, and we're using those monies in the state of Maine to provide rebates for consumers to purchase electric vehicles and to increase our infrastructure across the state of Maine for electric vehicle charging stations. So we know that we have to prepare our state and our communities for climate change and impacts that can't be avoided. Our governor's office of the future, during my campaign for governor, I often quoted Kurt Vonnegut, who once said, "Every government, every cabinet ought to have a department of the future." I said, we don't have that in Maine. Now we do. It's called an Office of Innovation, Policy, Innovation, and the Future, which I created, and we've hired a senior climate resilience coordinator, fancy term, to lead our communities dealing with issues on climate change and accommodations and resiliency, adaptation to rising sea levels, warming seas, and the like. We're investing in the replacement and upgrading of road infrastructure at steam crossings. I think that could be summarized in one word: culverts. The more modern culverts, they don't strangle the fish and let them pass easily. And those projects will mitigate flood risks, road washouts, and reduce erosion impacts to streams, brooks, and lakes. And that project itself has brought together unlikely suspects, but environmentalists, sportsmen and women, contractors, building contractors have all come together behind the culvert projects in our state. They all see an advantage to their interests there. Our Maine Climate Council's Community Resiliency Working Group is exploring ways to prepare our public health system for climate-induced or intensified health impacts, including tick-borne diseases. We're seeing a lot of ticks come up from the south because of warming temperatures. So the deer and moose population have been impacted by that. You can fly over some of the woods in Maine and see moose that have been eaten raw by ticks. And that, of course, can bring Lyme disease as well. Looking at foodborne and waterborne disease outbreaks and even the mental health impacts of disasters and heat waves and floods. We're protecting infrastructure assets that are critical to public safety and to Maine's economy, providing technical assistance and funding programs to Maine's small and rural towns so they can do their own resilience work, not lie back and think about what it was like 20, 40, 50 years ago, but look to the future, see what changes you can predict. The Governor's Energy Office and Maine Emergency Management are improving and updating our energy assistance or assurance and energy management plan, including discussions around vulnerable infrastructure, utility lines, cybersecurity, grid management. Maine's Climate Council's Energy Work Group is identifying strategies to increase resiliency of our assets, our energy assets and grid infrastructure against severe weather and natural hazards. 2 years ago, we had a terrific windstorm around Halloween. Basically, the state went dark and lost power for 3 days. We want to make sure that kind of thing doesn't happen again. So those efforts are a start, but Maine now has an opportunity to develop a more comprehensive and coordinated framework for resiliency. The magnitude of adaptation in our small state is still daunting. Consider this narrow slice of infrastructure. 12 to 15 of Maine's 50-plus wastewater treatment plants are highly vulnerable to sea level rise. Don't think too long about that. Upgrading just those assets alone, wastewater treatment plants, will carry a price tag in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And we just heard about the discussion of the federal government's participation in infrastructure plans, or non-participation at this point. Our roads and piers, waterfronts, our grid, our communities will each need investments at that scale or higher. Maine is looking to nearby states like Rhode Island and Connecticut and New York, which have infrastructure bags, I understand, or green bags, to finance large resilience projects. Maine, New York, Massachusetts, New York, and Minnesota have robust technical assistance programs that guide and support and provide funding to communities for resilience and sustainability. I think states should also pursue opportunities for collaboration. We all, in the Northeast and the New England states, we share the grid. We should push for policies of a national or regional infrastructure bank, that kind of thing. That could be one such opportunity for collaboration. So we've come a long ways. We're digging deep. One of the first things I did was to lift the moratorium my predecessor had imposed on wind power. We're looking seriously at more land-based wind power, more solar. We lifted the restrictions on net metering so that there were more solar power projects, more than 300 community solar projects waiting permitting right now all across the state of Maine. And again, looking at offshore wind, not just looking at it, developing it with research done by our university. So I'm looking forward to hearing what other states have done to meet similar threats. Given the extent of our waterfront, coastal waterfront, that's the major impact that we have in Maine. So looking forward to hearing from the rest of you.